First of all, I want to thank you for coming. This will be maybe a little more informal since it's a smaller group, but what we want to do today is talk about this new report that ITIF and United for Medical Research is releasing today called Healthy Funding. And it's really about how do we ensure a funding and budget process, what are the steps and the mechanisms that Congress can enable and enact and engage in that are going to make sure that we have the kind of funding we need for NIH to go forward. This is obviously critical, not just for ensuring the health of Americans, and as we'll hear, I think, from a couple of folks here, you know, the importance of actually accelerating the progress on important diseases and other medical problems. But as we heard the other night when we had a small dinner with Francis Collins, just how important this is to our global competitiveness. What's really striking now is how many countries are putting major investments into life sciences. This was a report that we did a couple of years ago now called Leadership in Decline, excuse me. We doubled NIH funding on a bipartisan level, but if you look at the last 6 or 8 years, it's actually, maybe longer, about 10 years, it's actually down 25% in inflation-adjusted dollars. So everybody has in their mind, oh, we fixed NIH, we doubled the budget. In fact, we doubled it, but then we stopped, and with inflation, it's been cut. When you then put into effect GDP growth, and sort of say, how have we kept that? The decline is even more severe. Now you compare that with other governments, like the Scandinavian governments, like China. China, for example, good example of that, if anybody saw that article on, I think it was in Time magazine on Beijing Genomics Institute, it's called BGI. BGI has an enormous amount of money from the Chinese government. In fact, BGI has more genomic sequencers at one institute in China than in the entire United States combined. And that's because the Chinese government has a large checkbook, and they just write checks to BGI. And one of the things BGI does with all that money, besides buying thousands and thousands and thousands of genomic sequencers, is they bribe the best talent in the world to come over there. And they give them, they'll say, okay, you come here, we'll give you $20 million to establish a world-class lab and hire anybody you want, and we'll give you a really good salary. But other countries are doing that too, and I just want to say one more country before I introduce folks, and that's the United Kingdom. So you look at the UK, as everybody knows, it's led by a conservative government, the David Cameron government. And David Cameron is very focused on free markets. He's very focused on fiscal responsibility. But one of the things they've really done in the last couple of years is they have completely turned direction and said, look, if we're going to be a vibrant, thriving economy in the global economy, we have got to build our case on life sciences because it's one of their core strengths. And so they've reversed funding cuts or stagnation, and now they're boosting funding for their national life sciences R&D. So if the conservative Cameron government can do this, who's completely focused on fiscal responsibility and cutting government waste, certainly we can do that because our life sciences sector is much stronger, although it may not be for long. So I want to introduce our panel today. We're really pleased that Congressman Scott Peters is going to join us, but we want to get underway, and if the Congressman joins us, we'll have an interlude, obviously, to hear him. But I'll just go in this direction. Joe Kennedy is a senior fellow at ITIF, and Joe's really the lead author of this report. He's had a number of positions in government before, including chief economist at the Department of Commerce, general counsel on the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. Margaret Anderson is the executive director of Faster Cures, which is a center of the Milken Institute, focused on a critical goal, which is to save lives by speeding up and improving the medical research system. And she has a long background in this area, including on the board of the United Medical Steering Committee, Institute of Medicine's Forum on Drug Discovery. Nice to see you. I'm just finishing intros, and I'll turn it over to you. Beth Ann Felder is the Director of Federal Affairs at Johns Hopkins. Prior to joining Hopkins about a decade ago, she spent 12 years in the U.S. Senate as Chief Counsel to the Budget Committee, so has real insights both into life sciences and budgeting. And Bill Hoagland is Senior Vice President for the Bipartisan Policy Center, which I think everybody knows. Great group in town that brings together groups from both sides of the aisle to tackle tough questions and he helps manage health and economic policy questions there. Before joining BPC, he was Cigna's Corporate Vice President of Public Policy, and then was also had a long background on the Senate Budget Committee. So we have a sort of real strength here in congressional budgeteers that can help contribute to this discussion. And then last but obviously not least, we're really honored that Congressman Scott Peters can join us. He is representing the California's 52nd district, which includes San Diego. It's really interesting, Congressman. I was just in San Diego a couple weeks ago, and
lucky man.
I was lucky because it was like 9 degrees here and 74 degrees there. And I realized why everybody goes to San Diego, because we were here at UC San Diego doing an event and looking out over the water, and it couldn't get any better than that. But anyways, the conversation went to sort of how San Diego went from essentially a tourism and Navy town 50 years ago, and that was it. And now, if you look at sort of biotech hubs around the world, life sciences hubs around the world, San Diego is in the top, certainly the top 10, probably the top 5 in the U.S., largely because of Scripps, UC San Diego, and federal funding that has enabled that ecosystem to really thrive. In Congressman Peters' time in office, he's been a champion of more funding for scientific research and NIH, advocating against the sequester and leading colleagues for support here. So for NIH, so we really thank you for your strong commitment to this and helping your colleagues to understand the importance of this. So maybe you could just open up with why you see this as important, or maybe how you see the frame going for the next year here.
Well, thanks for having me, and I spoke to some of you, and they wanted me to say what I said the other night, so I apologize if I say it again. Just on your opinion, San Diego is either second or third in the country. We're second in number of scientists, and we're third in amount of investment. Great. And obviously it's been very important to the diversification of our economy, and we're really proud of what's happening up on Torrey Pines Mesa. When I was a candidate for Congress the first time, I was elected first in 2012, I visited the Salk Institute. And Salk Institute filled up a room like this, smaller than this, with some of the top scientists around who heard that someone who might be in Congress was coming to visit. And they told me the story you all know, which goes something like, it takes until you're 40-some years old to get the lab where you can start to compete to get the grants. In the good times, we would fund maybe 25% of those grants because we were competing against the best talent in the country. Now we're funding 7%. So what's happening is the best scientists in the world who are my age mostly are in the United States, but a lot of the best scientists who are the age of some of the people at this table with us are thinking about whether they want to be committed to science at all, research science, or if they do, other places where they're getting funding, China, Singapore, England, Israel. Everyone else has picked up our playbook, as Francis Collins said. So I think that the investment in the NIH in particular is pretty fundamental for the country. We have a lead in science. We're not going to maintain it if we don't invest in it. Just as if we should think of it just as if we would think about bridges and roads falling down, except those are easy to replace. A couple observations in terms of advocacy. I'm not sure where everyone in this, is this a mostly congressional group or?
Mostly.
Yeah. So one of the things I think we ought to think about, you all experience these people with, I call them people with the sashes that come in for different diseases. The problem with the funding situation now is that they all see themselves in competition. And for us to really expand the nation's commitment to science, we need those people working together to grow a bigger pie. So we can't have juvenile diabetes in competition with pancreatic cancer, which is sometimes I think where we are. What we really need to do is get those people to be for a bigger pie. And the reason for that is a lot of the natural advocates for science come from places where there are universities, Boston, San Diego, San Francisco, Raleigh, Durham, Minneapolis. Those people don't always vote the same way as the rest of the country. It's not the kind of inputs that mean as much to people from Kansas or rural Wisconsin. But patient advocates are everywhere. And so I'm going to try to figure out ways to get patient advocates group to talk to the Congress as a whole, because everyone has someone with Alzheimer's in their district, and everyone sees kind of what that does, and the opportunity that we can provide if we continue to invest. The fundamental phenomenon people are up against right now is the tyranny of this year's money, is what I refer to this focus on this year's budget. Now, there are a couple problems with that. One is from a perspective of the country. It's silly to say we're just not going to invest in something because it has a cost this year without looking at what we get back from it. Okay? We would never make that decision as a family, because if we did, we would never send our kid to college. We would say, that's $50,000 I'm going to save, right? But of course, all of us would look at what that means for our child in the future over a lifetime. We need to view science the same way. They have to look at the return. And one of the things that I'm trying to do as someone who's interested in this concept of dynamic scoring is I'd like to apply it to that same kind of concept and analysis to what we're investing in. So if we spend money on science this year, what does it bring back? And that's going to be the only complete way we can deal with budgeting. So we're pushing that, investigating that. We'll do some announcement on that as soon as the law writers get back to us. The other thing is just internally from a patient perspective, we don't invest in prevention. I've had scientists in San Diego posit that if we could just delay the onset of the top 10 chronic diseases in the general population by 10 years on average, we would solve the healthcare spending crisis. But we couldn't get, if we were to invest in drugs that would prevent someone from getting diabetes at age 15 and maybe have that person get diabetes at age 25 instead, that would make some sense, but it would only get scored in this year's money. Again, so we're not really thinking like a regular business or a family would. We're so focused on this year's budget, and we call that fiscal responsibility. I suggest that's really not a full understanding of what fiscal responsibility is. Finally, I would just state what's going to be pretty obvious pretty soon is that we're in a presidential race cycle. Gosh, they come fast, huh? I mean, I just got off a really highly contested campaign, and already people are talking about it 2 years from now, and that's the schedule. But boy, if we don't engage every single presidential candidate in a discussion of what are you going to do for science, what commitment are you going to make, what will you do to provide adequate and consistent funding that will assure our young people that science is a career for them here, that will maintain our lead in science, we got to be ashamed of ourselves. We have to encourage a campaign that's about the future, and part of that has to be investing in science. I think everyone here would agree with that, but we ought to be thinking about how we make sure that we're competitive into the future, and presidential candidates ought to be talking to that. One phenomenon I would just mention to you that you might find some allies in is defense. I think I talked about this the other night, maybe I did. In the defense retreat, it's become pretty clear, and I'm a Democrat, but I'm a defense, pro-business Democrat, but I have a lot of friends who are what I call defense Republicans, and they're frustrated with people in their party who think the sequester is working. We know what it's doing to defense on the Armed Services Committee, and we know it's not working. And a lot of us, I wasn't here when it was adopted, but a lot of us would just vote to repeal it. And there are a lot of reasons to do it. It's just not the right approach, but it causes a real issue. One of the issues coming up in defense this year is the ascension of technology in China. And everyone who's on the Armed Services Committee has heard briefings about whatever gap we had, whatever lead we had over China, that gap is closing or is closed by this year or next year. So there's a premium in that sphere in making sure we're investing in science. And so there's an opportunity to talk more generally and broadly about the importance of science to our national security and our economic security, and I hope you all help me engage in that discussion. That's my pitch.
So I think we're done.
Okay,
Right?
that's it.
Do this, and we'll be in good shape. In all seriousness, thank you so much, Congressman. We're obviously supporters of dynamic scoring on this kind of thing. It's clear that investments in science and skills development and infrastructure have a payoff.
Right.
No question about that. Whether it's a big, whether it's 0.1 or whether it's 1.0, so makes sense to do it. So, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, good luck.
Great. Okay, thank you.
If I can be helpful to anyone, be in touch with Anthony or anyone on my staff. We'd love to, this is one of my top areas. I talk about this, veterans, and energy. So if there's any help I can provide to anybody, or want me to talk to your bosses, I'm happy to do that too. I think there's a lot of opportunity.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks, good luck, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I want to turn over now and get a little more into the meat of the budget question. And I'm going to turn it over to Joe Kennedy, who was the lead author of this. Joe, do you want to just kind of give us a sort of thumbnail sketch of what we found in the report and what we recommended?
Sure. First of all, it was a great pleasure to work on this report. I think it's a very interesting and very important issue. Everybody, I think, knows that all discretionary programs are suffering budget crunch, and that is the result largely of increases in mandatory programs. And I think the crunch is only going to get worse until we deal with the mandatory programs. So within that, and I think that sort of crunch is also the main cause for why, in real terms, NIH spending has declined over the last more than a decade now. So the purpose of the paper was to see within that context, what could we or should we do to try and improve NIH's budget, hopefully by increasing the funding, but also by making, introducing more stability and flexibility. Especially for an agency like NIH, having greater certainty about what the budget is going to be, and having some more flexibility in how you can spend the appropriated amounts is very important. So the paper starts first by trying to make a brief case why NIH spending is important, and especially within the budget context. And it cites some research that's appeared in previous ITIF and UMR studies showing that NIH funding actually can help improve the deficit situation, both by reducing the future cost of treating healthcare conditions, but also by boosting growth. And there's a pretty strong link between federal support for biomedical research and private sector activity in that same sphere. Second, the paper looks briefly at how some other countries have seemingly succeeded in making long-term commitments to biomedical research, including the United Kingdom, which at first cut government spending and then saw a pretty significant decline in the private sector biomedical industry, and so reversed course and has made over the last couple of years a major commitment to increased funding. So other countries have succeeded in doing this. And then the paper looks at existing budget models that Congress already uses for different agencies, and in some cases even already for the NIH, and tries to see how those could help NIH. So, and I want to thank, some of you may know Marcus Peacock, who used to head the Budget Committee in the Senate at the staff level, and he was enormously helpful in helping me think out a way to present these. So you can think that, NIH, for the most part, is a discretionary program that needs annual appropriations, and the appropriations last 1 year, by and large. So another alternative on the extreme end would be to have a mandatory program that is passed by the authorizing committee sets out basic things that NIH is gonna do, and then the money just automatically flows to NIH, and it doesn't need to go through annual appropriations. And NIH already has 2 mandatory programs, both dealing with diabetes. They're relatively small, given the size of NIH. They happen to expire every year, so Congress needs to reauthorize them, and if it created another mandatory program, it would have to find a pay for. You could think about creating a dedicated stream of income, rather than paying for NIH through taxpayer revenues. You could think about carving out a separate stream of revenue that would go into, say, a trust fund, and then either with appropriations or without the need of appropriations would go into NIH spending. And at one time, there was a proposal over a decade ago, I think, to impose a small tax on health premiums. And then this tax revenue would go into NIH funding and other biomedical funding. That didn't pass, but you could think of, reviving that or having other streams. It would obviously make some sense if the revenue stream had some logical connection to biomedical or scientific research. So that would be one. And if you wanted to keep the Appropriations Committee involved, you could require that money only come out of the trust fund when it's appropriated. There have been some issues with prior models. PTO, for example, it raises a lot of revenue on user fees, but it's had some trouble getting permission to spend those user fees. Congress hasn't always appropriated the full amount. In other cases, I think the harbor maintenance tax revenues are very high, but they've sat in the trust fund, and Congress has only allowed the agency to spend a portion of those fees on maintaining the harbors. So it isn't necessarily a complete solution. Another option is advance funding. So for most agencies, Congress spent the last year deciding what their budget would be for the current fiscal year. For a few agencies, that had already been decided, and the debate was on, well, what's going to be the funding for the next fiscal year. And then for one agency, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, it's actually 2 years in advance. And so this doesn't necessarily increase the total amount of money that would be spent on NIH, but it gives NIH more certainty and a greater heads up about what its actual funding is likely to be. It allows it to plan in advance, and it excuses NIH from the risk of being shut down if there's an inability to pass a current CR. So, and that has some value. You could also think about multi-year appropriations. So NIH has a separate budget for facilities, buildings and facilities. That money doesn't have to be spent in the next fiscal year. There's no limit on when that money can be spent. Congress can always revoke it until it's spent, but it can just sit there until NIH is ready to sign the contracts to build a new building or refurbish a building. You could, on the rest of the NIH funding, it expires at the end of the fiscal year. You either spend the money or you lose it. Or you could think about giving NIH another year to spend it, or another 6 months to spend it. And that would give NIH some flexibility in moving money from one year to another, but it would also ease the deadline that occurs sometimes at the end of the year, where you have to get money out the door. Even if you think you could spend it a little more wisely if you had a couple more And that again, wouldn't necessarily increase the total amount of money going to NIH, but it would ease, it would give it more flexibility and make it easier to manage the money. Finally, you could think about a deal where Congress increased the caps on discretionary spending, but did so in a way that the money could only be spent on NIH. And this has already been done for 2 programs. Congress makes use of one, it doesn't make use of the other. You would want the appropriators not to lower NIH spending because they knew this extra pot of money was available. So part of the deal would be, well, the appropriators have to fund NIH at last year's budget, or last year's budget plus 1%. You know, and then if they do that, then the caps rise, say by $1 billion or $3 billion, and that money can only be spent on NIH. So they don't have to spend that money, but they can't devote that money to any other agency. If they're going to spend it, they have to appropriate it to NIH. And that seems to be, you know, I won't comment on the probability of that happening, but that if you look at the bills that have been introduced, both, there was at least 2 last year, and then there have been a couple this session, that seems to be what the sponsors of bills who are trying to increase NIH funding, that seems to be the approach they're taking. And so, you know, I think that probably is, if the goal is to get an increase in total NIH spending, that probably at this time is the most likely strategy to pursue.
Great.
So with that,
Okay, thank you, Joe. Now, we'll end precisely before 12:30. So I want to drill down in some of the budget questions in particular, and get into this with Bill and the discussion with folks. But before we do that, I want to just maybe ask Margaret and Beth to comment a little bit on sort of stepping back and saying, you know, kind of why do we care about this? Maybe Margaret, you know, obviously medical innovation is a complex ecosystem. You've got a lot of different players. You got startup biotech companies. You got bigger established companies, and then you have the federal government through NIH, NSF, and other organizations that are funding knowledge creation, and then hopefully that gets transferred. How do you see that playing out, and what do you see as the effects of kind of frankly, cuts in real dollars of NIH budgeting?
Absolutely. So thank you all for being here. We appreciate you squeezing into the tiny little space here. And United for Medical Research is, you know, really excited about this report that we commissioned, because I think that it does kind of crystallize some of the work that's happening internationally, and it's starting to help us understand what would happen here if we keep turning the spigot off, which is what's been happening with NIH dollars. So to the question about, you know, what happens if we start turning it off at the beginning of the pipeline, if you don't fund basic science, if you're not funding this kind of creative discovery, you won't have anything to translate into treatments and cures. So Faster Cures is really devoted to looking at the whole medical research system, and you know, through endeavors like the 21st Century Cures work, you know, happening here on the House side, and now the Senate's looking at it. You know, I think one of the factoids that's been coming out is that we have upwards of 10,000 known diseases, but we really only have treatments for about 500 of them. So the likelihood that when, because it's quite honestly, it's inevitable, when we are diagnosed with something, there probably won't be something there for us to take or, you know, do to fix the disease. So how do you get that? You get it through funding at the beginning of that pipeline. And you know, Beth will talk about the universities and the way that they're sort of the crown jewels of this infrastructure. So it is a passing of the baton, but if we, you know, collectively ignore that funding equation, it will be at our own peril. Now, the report highlights, you know, and it was discussed, some of the work that's happening globally. Clearly, the world has woken up to life science as a growth investment. They are reading our playbook and they're implementing it. What is not happening though, with enough specificity is using the formula that the United States has pioneered in terms of making sure you fund that basic research. So we cannot just leave it to the rest of the world to pick up the slack, because there is no guarantee that they will. There's also something, and the congressman was speaking about it from the San Diego perspective. There is a secret sauce, and that's not necessarily captured in the report, but the secret sauce in terms of the entrepreneurship that comes out of the US life science industry. The advances that we have are because of this whole ecosystem being able to work together. But, really the fuel for the engine is the NIH budget, the NIH dollar, and, even in the title of the report, the sustainable, predictable funding. You cannot run a business where you do not know from year to year how much money you will have to fund it. And, many of you are of the age cohort where you've had to make decisions about your careers. So imagine if you're a young scientist and you've decided to go for it. Get your PhD, maybe, try to work in a lab, but you have no idea if the funding will be there. And, to the point that was raised about the, sort of the average time, the age that you get your first NIH grant, by the time you hit your 40s, you want a little predictability in life, right? You guys might not be there, but, maybe you want a house, maybe you want to raise a family, you want a little financial security. It's getting more and more difficult for those young scientists to stay in the field because they don't know if there will be predictability. So we are, kind of really having this, apple cart being very upset where we don't know, kind of what to tell the young scientists, let alone the existing scientists who have established labs. So I'll let Beth talk about, the peril of that from the Hopkins perspective and other universities that are part of UMR.
Thank you, Mark. And just actually on that point, it was really interesting. I was up on IBM had a really cool event earlier this week. I moderated on essentially the brain computer, and they're developing this computer. They have developed it, but actually it doesn't work the way a regular computer works. It's sort of, I don't know. I'm not a computer scientist. Parallel processing and all this stuff, and it mimics the brain. It's incredible breakthrough, and a lot of it was supported by federal funding research. But one of the points there was, it's actually one of the things that's holding back IBM is the fact that we don't understand the brain well enough. And so there's this linkage between brain research that you wouldn't think of has anything to do with computing. But I was talking with a gentleman there afterwards. He came up to me and he said, he introduced himself, and I said, what are you doing? He goes, well, I have a PhD. I got a PhD from a leading university in this country, and I was in a lab and I was doing brain research. I said, oh, that's so great. What are you doing here? He goes, well, I saw what was happening with funding. I saw my colleagues, my counterparts, and my lab directors really struggle with funding and not be able to get it. And I just said, I don't want to live my life that way. So we came to Washington. I was like, man, why are you in Washington? We don't do anything in Washington. You guys are the ones that are discovering the cures. We're not discovering the cures. We need people like you in the lab. And it was just, to me, a real life story. I mean, if here's somebody who spent all this time and effort and gets his PhD, perhaps could contribute major innovations to understanding the human brain. And he said, I'm not going to do it because it's too risky now.
Well, I think to the point in the report about some of the opportunities for stable funding, if you look at an example like the war on cancer that President Nixon initiated, that war on cancer and the associated funding and the NCI focus has now allowed us to see opportunity in oncology that is unprecedented. I left a meeting called the Melanoma Research Alliance, and they're also a member of UMR. I just left there this morning. I mean, immunotherapy has transformed not just melanoma science, but oncology. It's because of all that early investment that they have that. And to your point about neuroscience and brain research, we need the same investment there. Because if you look at the statistics of the impending tsunami of Alzheimer's and what that will do to our society, not just in an interpersonal way, but in the healthcare cost way. So the way we're going to get to treatments for Alzheimer's and other neuroscience issues will be through that seed corn from the NIH.
Great, thank you. Beth?
Sure, a couple thoughts. First, just a comment about UMR in general, because what Mr. Peters said made me think about this. He was talking about the sort of parade he sees of people coming to his office from very well-organized, very important patient advocacy groups. And one of the reasons, actually, a couple of us started UMR now back in 2008, was to address that very issue. We had 8 members then, we have 26 now, and we have members from the research tools and diagnostics industry, universities, large leading patient advocates, Margaret's organization, to address that very issue of let's not fight over the pie, let's all work to make the pie bigger, which is really the point of this report. You know, we went through the exercise of talking about the value of research, and which is extremely important. And we've been doing that for a number of years now. And we keep doing the same thing and we get the same result. We get, relatively speaking, very incremental increases, you know, $100 million, which is a lot to an appropriator. I get that. Bill and I used to sit across the table from appropriators and sort of torture them a little bit when we were at the budget committee. But in an enterprise that's $3 billion, in a nation where the enterprise is many-fold bigger than that, $100 million isn't going to move the needle. So we have got to think of new ways. We've got to think outside of the box. How are we going to make it safe and create the conditions in which members get to vote for increases? They all, when we visit your offices, and we all do that, I don't think anyone's ever told me they didn't support biomedical research. What they can't figure out how to do is how to vote for something that's going to exceed the budget caps or cause a point of order to be raised against the bill. So we're hoping this report will spawn a conversation among you and your colleagues and your bosses on how to do that, how to get TS. So back to sort of the case. What we're seeing at Hopkins is probably played out all over the country. We're a little bit more fortunate than others. We've been in this business a long time. Hopkins is the largest recipient of federal research funding from the federal government. So we're good at it. Our scientists are good at writing grants, but I will tell you, they still, even though they're good at it, spend way too much time doing that instead of being in the lab doing a science or mentoring young scientists so that they can learn how to go through the rigorous process of writing the grants. And we are at this really, what's so tragic about it now is we are at this inflection point where a lot of the technology we need to make these advances have, in a sense, caught up with the creativity that scientists have had for a long time. We've sequenced the genome. There are faculty at Hopkins who used to do this by hand. That's how they figured out. You know, the work that led to Francis being able to do it was started by people in labs, and they would take months to sequence genome by hand, literally. And it used to be done in this really crappy old grocery store, actually, that was converted to lab space in East Baltimore. But now we have sequencers that we can do dozens of them at a time, hundreds of them at a time, you know, how bigger technologies. The advances that have been made in radiology and neuroimaging are why we can have the brain initiative. Because before, to study the brain, cut someone's head has been look at it. Now we don't have to do that anymore. So that the opportunity to make those kind of advances that people have known what the questions were for a really long time, we now actually have the tools to start to find the answers. And we're, you know, turning off the spigot, whatever, squeezing the pipeline, whatever analogy you want to use. And I think that's what's so frustrating for folks on our campuses. It's frustrating for the young folks who are trying to get funding. The uncertainty is, you know, we risk sending people out of the field. Although having worked on the Hill for a long time, working at Hopkins, I would say having people with scientific backgrounds in policymaking roles is actually very important, and is actually something this country does not have nearly enough of. I think we'd be a lot farther along this debate if we had some more scientists in Washington. So not to disagree,
Well,
but
I was making a point of that.
but I understand.
We want both.
we do want both. So I just hope that we can kind of, and I know Bill will have some thoughts about how these different mechanisms can work, and hopefully maybe help us figure out how to convince people about them.
So-
But we can't lose this opportunity. It's too important.
So, you know, just oftentimes when you get in this debate or this dialogue, it's, you know, it's pretty abstract. But let me give you a specific example, because you mentioned Hopkins. So there's a doctor up there who's a practicing doctor and also a research doctor. I think Mara Gillison. Anyway, Dr. Gillison.
There are like 5,000 of them.
Okay, there's a lot of people. But anyway, she was studying throat cancer, and in particular the relationship of throat cancer to human papillomavirus, which if you saw the Michael Douglas story. That was her. She figured that out. And she figured it out basically on NIH funding. And one of the things that she figured out is that there's a vaccine now. And everybody who's, I don't know what age your kid's supposed to get this vaccine, 14? 12. You get this vaccine, and you have a vaccine against throat cancer from HPV. You can get it from smoking some of it. So that, in real life, is going to save, I don't know the number, but thousands of lives. And it was only because she could do that research at Hopkins with federal funding.
Well, and it will also transform, it's also relevant to cervical cancer. So downstream, it's going to completely transform, the way that women have clinical visits. So you're gonna ultimately get to a point with the vaccinated population where pap smears are not going to be, as relevant as they are today, because someone will have been protected.
As long as we don't let people usually off that vaccine. That's a good question. Bill?
Wow. Budget, just see all these young people, there may be a few that around here. Just a little background so you know before I get started, since I work at the Bipartisan Policy Center, which was established about 7 years ago by former majority leaders of the United States Senate, Senator Howard Baker, recently deceased, Senator Bob Dole, Senator Tom Daschle on the Democratic side, and Senator George Mitchell. And my responsibilities there cover fiscal issues, health issues, immigration, number of issues. But as Rob's indicated, before I came to the Bipartisan Policy Center, I spent a long time up here, literally about 30-some years, beginning with the establishment, and more than that, yes, now, establishment of the Congressional Budget Office, which celebrated its 40th anniversary just the day before yesterday when Alice Rivland was sworn in as the first director of it. She, young people, you'll find out once you work for these bosses, as Beth and I have found out, you work for them for life. And Senator Domenici, who was the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, which I worked with, Senator Frist, who I worked with, and Alice Rivland, who was my first boss, really, at the Congressional Budget Office. I'm still working with them to this day. Budgeteers tend to be wet blankets. We are not very upbeat, and so I hope that I'm not too down, because quite frankly, I believe strongly in what has been said around the table here, that investment in science, technology, infrastructure is the seed corn of the future. I have an agriculture background, so I believe I will use that analogy. It's an investment for the future. And that clearly in the United States, our budgets have been under tremendous strain over the last many years, as there's been a focus on debt and deficits. And we still have that problem. So let me just say I compliment Joe and the work and the staff in putting together this document. I think you outlined a number of potential approaches. I will probably cut to the chase and just give you my suggestions on how you might want to proceed with it. But just as you were taking notes, you probably noticed there were about 6 things that Joe outlined as an approach. And I'll try to respond to just each one in about a second each. Mandatory spending. Converting this to mandatory spending, forget it. It's not going to happen. I'm sorry, it's not. 2, dedicated funding sources, taxes. Taxes on health insurance premiums, forget it. The Affordable Care Act, not going to happen. I'm talking about now. I'm talking about the reality of this Congress going forward. Joe didn't mention it, I don't want to go into it. Budgeteers will know what this chimps changes in mandatory spending in a appropriation bill that creates further spending. Maybe. Advanced appropriations, number 4. On advanced appropriations, Joe highlighted, which I think is very important, which I think is a good proposal. And that is, it gives stability, thoughtfulness going forward, gives an opportunity to be able to plan ahead of time. In science and technology, I think it's more than a one-year horizon, it's multi-year. And so from that perspective, I think advanced appropriations is a good approach within, again, it will be within existing law, existing discretionary caps. Multi-year appropriations, Department of Defense puts together a budget, as Joe mentioned, we have other agencies. Multi-year appropriations, I think tied to advanced appropriations is a possibility. But limited. And so I come down to the sixth proposal, which is adjust the caps, quote, adjust the caps. With all due respect to Congressman Peters, we're not eliminating a sequester. We are living within a cap. The caps are set. They are law right now. If you appropriate over that cap, there will be a sequester. So when I understand, I work with politicians, I understand the spend, we're eliminating, what we're doing is eliminating the caps and funding above the caps. It's not, if you go over the caps and you don't adjust, change the caps, then clearly there's a sequester. But we're talking about living in the caps all the way to 2018. And those caps are extremely tight. I will be the first one to admit. The rate of growth through 2021 as they're in existence is about a 1.8% annual rate of increase in the discretionary caps. 1.8% annual rate of increase. Adjusted for inflation, that's a negative, I think, 0.5% growth relative to where we are today. The reality is such, I'm sorry to tell you, we have a Republican-controlled Congress on the House and Senate. All cards on the table, I work for Republicans. Your budget committee here in the House, and if you're from the Senate, your budget committee in the Senate will be marking up a budget resolution here within the next, before you go out for your Easter Passover recess. That budget resolution is very likely to retain these caps, period. It will be difficult, but I believe there's another goal that's been set, particularly I look around the room here for the young people, and that is your future. And your future is impacted not only by research investment and that, but also by the accumulation of debt. And the debt that we're passing on, which will be the major hallmark of these discussions, will be that the level of debt in this country continues to grow, even though the deficit is coming down because of interest rates going up. And so there will be an extreme effort made by the two budget committees to balance the budget in 10 years. I am glad I am not the staff director of the Senate Budget Committee today, and my heart goes out to them, how you do this. How do you balance when the deficit in 10 years, by your own estimates up here from the old office I worked with, Congressional Budget Office is $1.1 trillion. Even one budget is about 800. How do you do this without increasing taxes, with proposals probably to increase defense spending someplace along the line here? The caps will remain, I can assure you. So what out of this current situation, and Rob, I'm sorry I give you this notice.
Hey, what a downer.
What is the solution here to where you want to go? And I think Joe has highlighted it as it relates to the adjustments to the caps based upon appropriation of a base. We used to call them reserve funds and adjustments. I would argue that what the best likelihood for the president's budget, of course, increase the caps. $38 billion, defense $34 billion for non-defense for 2016. NIH budget will go from 30.3 under the president's budget to 31.3. That's a $1 billion increase. That's good. But I think it's gonna, unless it's possible you could achieve that without changing the caps, that means making some decisions someplace else within the non-defense categories. But those non-defense categories are education, transportation, infrastructure, other areas of science, border security, immigration. So there's going to be a lot of pressure on just living within those caps, and to get a $1 billion increase in NIH next year is possible. Where is Alan Spector when you need him? And well, young people won't know who that was, but I think it's going to be tough. So I would suggest that you focus going forward on something that Joe suggested as the last one, which was the adjustment to the caps by, and very critical, you made the point, I'm glad you made it, Joe, because if you hadn't, I was going to. You have to fund a base. You have to fund, if you tell the appropriators, I'm going to increase spending for NIH outside the caps, and you don't fund a base, I can assure you what they'll do. They won't fund the base, and they'll say, you've got this money outside the cap, or just the caps, and you end up being basically no change. So you have to have some way of adjusting for NIH specific upon the adoption of legislation that would increase it. And so we're not talking about increasing the overall cap, we're talking about increasing funding, if you like, the cap for NIH going forward. This is going to be tough, and I don't want to sugarcoat it here. I would only say that it's necessary that we increase this. I would love if we had a different political environment, myself, that we were dealing with, but we have to live with reality as it is right now. One last observation, it kind of ties back to, just this is a sidebar here. I note that this is the National Institutes of Health. And I was looking at their budget this morning. There are some 20 institutes, have I got it right? 27. It goes back to your point, Rob, at the outset. When I was up here, as Beth and I were here, we know how this works. The individual disease-specific groups come in. Part of the reason you have 27 is because of exactly that. There is some need here, I think, internally within NIH to think about the structure that they have here.
You have to change the law to do that.
And you have to change the law. And then finally, just and it really shows my age, when I came up here to begin working with the Congressional Budget Office 40 years ago, we had another agency up here. It was called the Office of Technology Assessment.
I worked there.
Yeah.
Hey, I did too. I didn't know you were there. We both worked there.
And CBO survived.
OTA still exists. It has no money. But it was never deauthorized.
Never was deauthorized. All I would say is, Rob, I think scientists such as yourself, I think there still is a need to have up here, if you're talking, because obviously CBO budget, not on the benefit side. And that would be a desire that I would see, though it's always hard to create a new agency on Capitol Hill. So with that, I will shut up, and I'm sorry for the message but I think you have to know the reality you're facing for 2016 budgets.
Can I ask you a question sort of related to budget things, because the congressman brought this up as well, and it came up in dinner the other night. You know, the House has passed a rule to have dynamic storing on the revenue side of the budget, and there is interest now in sort of, you know, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, to try to do something on the spending side as well. You know, leaving is there any opportunity, or do you see even having that conversation being helpful to this
I think it's a helpful discussion.
interest?
I've always said that, investments do create benefits in economic growth. And I think, and I've always argued, as you know, Beth, that it's not just on the tax side, but it's on, but as a budgeteer, I have to tell you, this is risky. I worked, as you, Beth, will remember, I had a brief stay as an administrator of the Food Nutrition Service, Department of Agriculture, where I had one of my programs was, which I think is a very good program, the Women, Infants, and Children, the WIC program. And I don't know how many times people would come in with their estimates and tell me if we spend $1 in WIC, we'll save $3 in the Medicaid program. And my response was, well, then we can eliminate the Medicaid program and just expand the entire WIC program. It's not just science technology if you go down the dynamic scoring route. You will have to deal with all the other investments out there in education and infrastructure. I think there is an argument to be made. I dislike the rule that came out of the House here, and apologize, and Duffy can tell your Republican friends I said that, that's fine. The bottom line is that it only applies to major pieces of legislation, which is their argument. And I do think, though, that it's unfair to apply it only to taxes, but I would argue because of the impact that has, broadly speaking, then I don't think it should be applied either to taxes, nor should it be applied to, at this point, spending.
At all? Or if you're gonna do one, you do both?
If you're gonna do one, you do, if you do one, you do them all. And since I don't think, I'm nervous about doing all, I would say you don't do any.
I want to let Joe have just a chance to respond to Bill, your comments, and then we'll open it up. But I do want to point out, you mentioned that NIH got, was it $1 billion? It sounds like a lot of money, but as Ev Dirksen said, billion here, billion there, you're talking about money. But, it's essentially a 3% increase. The CPI for medical research is more than the CPI for PPI. So it's probably what the PPI is for medical research, but probably 3%. If not more. So what you're really talking about is no funding increase in real dollars for NIH. Now, if you're a budgeter, you think it's real dollars, but in reality, it's not. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind. Joe?
Yeah, first I've known you a long, long time, and had great respect for Bill Hopper, and so I think you got the, you hit the politics sort of on the nail. I don't disagree on anything about the likelihood that you estimated for these things. I will say, I didn't get into it in the report, but the subcommittee, the appropriations subcommittee has gotten into the habit over the last couple of years of reducing spending in the mandatory program CHIP and moving that money into the discretionary accounts. And that's, I want to say that's been about $8 billion a year. CHIP, yeah. So CHIP expires this year, so they can't do that anymore. And so that means that this year's discretionary budget is effectively going to be, for the subcommittee, $8 billion less than last year's.
Can I just
Sure.
clarify? Are you talking about the Children's Health
Yes.
Insurance Program?
Yes.
Okay, I thought you were talking chimp.
Well, it is kind of a chimp, but it's a chip of chip. So, and that's why I didn't get into it. But, so CHIP is expiring, so they can't take this money and, move it from mandatory to discretionary. And so that, this year's budget, even within the, basically flat caps, is effectively going to be $8 billion less than last year's budget for the subcommittee. And so, that's going to hit everybody pretty soon, if they don't realize it now. I am a conservative more or less, and I believe we are going to hit a wall financially. Some people don't believe that; they believe the wall is mythical. but I believe we're gonna hit it, we're gonna, you know, we're already hitting it in selected cities, we're gonna hit it in Illinois and California within the next decade or so, and eventually we're gonna hit it in the federal government if we don't do something different. And so I think that's what drives a lot of this tight squeeze, and the feeling that you have to have caps on discretionary, even though the problem isn't mandatory, because otherwise you can't force Congress to deal with the problem before you hit the wall. And I don't see that, you know, that pressure easing beyond a moment or two when it just gets too great and we punt the ball for a little while. But the pressure is greater now than it was 5 years ago, 5 or 10 years ago. From now it's going to be only greater unless we deal with these fundamental issues on the mandatory side.
Margaret?
Bill, I wonder if I could ask you a question with your experience in this arena. Sometimes you have to pick a winner, right? Or you have to pick a horse. So, you know, what is your opinion about Congress's ability to put a bet on biomedical research versus just letting it continue on and essentially starving it and maybe losing our preeminence?
No,
I mean,
I think, Margaret, I think there's no question that you've been, the work that the foundation, that you and others have done out there certainly have made it, highlighted this. And I think there's no question that the science and advances that have taken place are just astonishing that can be done. I think they can place a high priority on this. I do think that given public restraint, public pressures that exist on public budgets, that I wish there was some way, it's basic research, but I wish there was some way you could leverage this in the private sector so that you could have more basic research done in the private sector. But I will admit up front that the basic research is not being done by the companies out there that then apply it to applied research to helping their bottom line. But I think there's no question that there is a increased attention being paid up here to bio.
well, and I was going to say that that valley of death, you know, the sort of middle of the funding pipeline has increasingly been picked up by the philanthropic, not-for-profit sector. Not completely, but you know, the groups like Cystic Fibrosis Foundation or Leukemia Lymphoma, you know, there's a multitude of these groups that we know and work with. They have often stepped into that void because of what you're talking about, which is that industry is saying, that is too risky, that's not our job, we need to develop product, and we're waiting for the government, you know, sort of basic science money to mature. So the not-for-profits come in and de-risk that investment, make it very enticing to industry. And, you know, so I think to your point, if we, in a dream world, we'd love to see industry be able to do that, but that's not, you know, it's already such a risky proposition to develop a drug or a device. It's, you know, there's so many misses to get the hit, and that's the nature of the beast, that science, there's a serendipity to it, and you have to try a lot of things to get to a result. But you have to have a lot of, you know, information to actually be able to turn that into something.
And that's what the universities have been really trying to do, is to partner more with industry and also use our philanthropic dollars from foundations or individual donors. I mean, that's actually the bright spot in my institution's balance sheet, whereas we hit our high point on NIH funding in nominal terms in 2011. But in that same period of time, we've been able to increase our foundation and corporate
Just to,
by
as a
50%.
data point.
But it's still small, it's not a,
Yeah, it's actually an interesting data point. We rank 23rd in the world in business funding of university R&D. 23rd. 22 other countries. One of the reasons we rank, and by the way, our number, you are the anomaly. If you look at the NSF numbers, business funding of university R&D is actually going down because of the high risk. But there's a second factor in that, and that's the structure of the U.S. R&D tax credit. Virtually every other country rewards corporate funding, business funding of their university research. We're the only country that penalizes it. So you can only, under the current R&D credit, you can only take 65% of the funding. So if you know, Amgen or something gives Hopkins $100 million to study a bunch of stuff, they can only take 65% of that if they did it in their own lab. we've been working with the White House and, on this, and made minor little improvement. Because talking about a downer, the real downer is Treasury, then, because they're like the worst. But they were overcoming Treasury opposition, and they're able to shift that in the president's budget, which I encourage everybody to look at, because it's a very good proposal, from 65 up to 75%. So that's a little bit of help to get more money. But the other thing it does in the president's budget is it expands what's called the alternative simplified credit from 14% to 18%, which is a big deal. And in our view, we've been a huge supporter of that. By the way, we rank 27th in R&D tax generosity in the world, according to the OECD. But those are steps in the right direction, and it gets to Bill's point that it's about government money, but it's also about getting the corporate sector more engaged in early stage research at universities.
I just want to say that, as probably all of you know, that the 21st century, the House has been working on the 21st century cures. And in some of their meetings, you and in a separate meeting, Michael Milken had, I thought, some very good ideas for reforms that could be made to get more private sector involvement. We didn't, that was sort of beyond the scope of this report, so we didn't include it, but I think.
In basic research?
Mike's ideas were related to, sort of being able to write off some of the costs that young scientists incur in their education. I think to go back to the basic piece, it wasn't necessarily to fill that void, but to the conversation that we're having now about the interchange between for-profit money and government money. There is sort of a difference in the way that the United States interprets that, and one of the provisions in 21st Century Cures right now is this consortium model that is modeled after the Innovative Medicines Initiative in Europe, which is very much for-profit industry money with EU money. And I would say you sort of referenced it in the report, and we've referenced it before in UMR materials, that Europe has very much woken up to the possibility of what life science will offer. But they're not necessarily, they're looking at the sort of end stage translation, how do you get to product. They're not focusing that money on some of the early stage. One thing that Faster Cures has been looking at is the public-private partnership model, the research by consortia idea. And that is something that we are seeing more of. There's a report that we did called the Consortiapedia, where we've watched the trajectory of the public-private partnerships go just straight up. A lot of them are European, but increasingly companies and universities, everybody in the ecosystem is realizing we're not going to get there from here without more collaboration. And so that pre-competitive space for industry has been, I think, a place that they're really looking at to try to answer questions collectively. So many of these include the NIH and FDA, but ADNI would be an example of one in the neuroscience area that everybody's very excited about what can get done when you start to put these players together. And that is being run through the Foundation for NIH. So there is a vehicle to do this work where you bring in for-profit money.
There's also a provision, actually, Domenici. We worked with Senator Domenici years ago, and we were able to insert a provision in the Energy Act. They did, we helped with the 2006 Energy Act that creates a collaborative R&D credit for energy consortia. So you take 20% of all your expenditures, just take 20% flat credit, much more generous than the regular credit. This could easily, there is a bill, and somebody's happy to, my emails are Atkinson@ITIF. If you give me your email, I can tell you what the bill is, but I don't remember it right now. There is a bill in the House that actually extends that collaborative R&D credit to health, so it would be energy and health. And this would be a big incentive because if companies are engaging in these consortia, it's a big risk for them because a lot of that knowledge gets spilled over. And so if you gave them a little bit more generous credit, you'd get a stronger incentive return. Let's open it up for some comments or questions from any of the folks around the room. Maybe you want to jump in and say who you are.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm with Center Alexander. So currently, how much is allocated for the NIH funding relative to like biomedical research or qualitative research? Would if your funding was increased, would you be allocating more towards biomedical, or like how would you focus still more on qualitative research? Or would it be just on like biomedical?
Are you referring to the split between basic science? Okay, so do you have that stat? I think it's around 65% of the NIH budget goes towards basic science
It's
funding.
actually 55.
Okay,
But I have to say, I don't know, you know, the line between basic and not basic is really pretty hazy these days, and, you know, I think people, particularly at my institution where we do a ton of what people think of as basic research. And so we wanna protect that, but I don't want people to get hung up, because there are lots of basic researchers who every day talk to clinicians and think that it's much more of a circle than a straight line kind of thing. But that's the current balance by the way NIH chooses to, where they choose to draw the line.
Right, so I don't think anyone is advocating that we would dictate the direction that the monies would go, but leave that up
That's
to the existing process.
So if you look at, I don't know if you look, when you look at an NIH appropriations bill, there's a lump sum, 30 billion-ish for NIH. And then there's an appropriation for the Office of the Director, and then each institute gets an appropriation. You know, NCI gets the biggest one it has for a long time. And that's about the level of detail that the appropriators get down to. Then the institute directors have a tremendous amount of discretion in consultation with Director Dr. Collins, and how they spread those monies out within their institute across the various mechanisms, you know, R1s, center grants, training grants.
Other questions?
Can I just add that Senator Alexander heard a lot about the 21st Century Cure Act over here in the House. I believe it's fair to say without Senator Alexander is also working on a similar bill that will focus on NIH and FDA.
Yes.
I have a question. I'm Kristen Mead, CEO of Mead Project Management in Fairfax, Virginia. And my firm represents clients who are very much interested in this continuum from, you know, R&D, public-private partnerships, how you move the big ideas forward. I just have a very quick question. I think it's best posed to this fellow there. When we experienced the Recovery Act funding, and there was an injection into NIH to push funds out, and it certainly had a framework, and they specify, you know, let's focus on infrastructure and try to build some things that are going to last past Recovery Act funding. But at your institution, what were some of the gains you saw from having an injection of funding, an increase in funding in those 2 years? Now that we're able to look back on it and see it.
I'll have to put my era hat back on. We did get some instrumentation out of it, which I think was very useful. A couple faculty got some of the, there were sort of some grants focused on particularly like innovative kind of cutting edge. But in all honesty, NIH had to get that money out the door, and the way they got most of that money out the door was by giving supplements to people who were on existing grants.
Right.
I mean, that was just the nature of the game. They put it in, they said, you know, use it or lose it, and that was the sort of most rational way for them to do it. So a lot of people, for a period of time, got to do more science, and now what's happened is, as NIH funding has decreased, you know, there's two things that actually have gone on. Fewer people are getting grants, as they get older, but also every single grant has gotten smaller. And this happens because you're on the CR or because you have a shutdown, but also because of the sequestered funding slip. So it's not that they've thrown a whole bunch of people out the door, they've made everybody's grant smaller. And what that does to science over the long term is actually kind of insidious, because it means if you've designed a research plan and you've got an idea and you plan to test it by doing your experiment 5 times so that you get good results and you know what you're doing, you're now maybe only going to do it 4 times or 3 times. And that, you know, at first you know it seems very rational, no big deal. In science, that's a big deal, and learning is lost when that happens. And that's, you know, that's the other catch-22 that we've put NIH in, that Congress says, you know, keep funding the grants everywhere, don't leave any state out, whatever. And so the only, because it's just math, it's just addition and subtraction, I guess it's a division here. You make every single grant smaller. So all the science, we are making it harder for every single person, even if they get funded. But there, you know, it was great while it happened, but it was a tremendously fleeting moment, because science doesn't happen like in 2 years.
No, and I think you make an important point that the actual effect on science itself is actually very damaging when you can't do the additional cycles of research.
And you can't count on being able to
And
do
how are
it.
you, and it affects the results, which are then published, and then we have this shakier infrastructure to operate and make decisions.
Yeah, I don't know if you're actually saying this, I actually don't agree with that. I think we've been better off with no money in the Recovery Act going
Oh,
down
no,
that
that's
before.
not what I'm saying.
So,
Yeah.
what we've been
What
better
I'm
off is
saying-
stability and growth,
Yeah.
but the money went to valuable
It
things.
did, but it was fleeting.
It was fleeting,
Very
I think that's
fleeting.
really the point.
And it wasn't like building a bridge, in 2 years you were done, you had
Right.
your bridge.
Yeah.
It was helpful at that moment and useful, but
Other questions, yes?
Ms. Crocker, my name is Thomas Crockett, I'm a research graduate. You mentioned that there were some benefits to be reaped by more scientists getting involved in policy and moving to DC, getting involved in our work. How would you move scientists to policy? What do you see them doing once they get
how would I move? Well, some of them are, it's happening because people actually become interested in it. I will say I've worked with faculty who actually get the policy bug, and maybe that happens because Baltimore's close to DC, and so they're really exposed to it. You know, one of the advantages that Phil and I experienced this when we worked for Senator Domenici, because he had the national labs, he always had a scientist on his staff. He always had actually a nuclear physicist on his staff. And that, the contribution that person was able to make to the thinking of that office and by extension our committee was really invaluable. These are complicated issues, and so if Congress is going to write science policy, you need to have a good understanding of how it's conducted and what the inputs are and what the results mean when you get them and understand. So as a sort of a personal thing. My dad's also a
Or to
scientist,
fund
but-
the office, refund the Office of Technology Assessment up here.
Okay, maybe the last question, yes, sir.
My question is almost the opposite of that. My name is Sam. I'm with Senator Debbie's staff now. I do research under an NIH grant, so thank you for the work that you're doing. A lot of my friends are thinking about leaving the country to do research elsewhere. As opposed to having scientists go into policy, how do we convince scientists to stay here, especially young people pursuing their PhDs?
Fund them. You just need to fund them.
Revoke their passports.
But it's, and you know, we experience that at Hopkins, and sometimes it's hard, you know, sometimes you can't say to a person with a straight face, no, don't go, because if if we know that we can't provide the bridge funding for them till things get better, you don't wanna hamper someone's career, we always say, no, please don't go.
Where are they going?
The two people that I'm familiar with are in the UK. The UK. So that's like, to follow up, funding is clearly going to be an uphill battle. And it's nice to tell people not to go, but.
Right, and for people who are really promising, they're going to be really sought out.
Yeah.
Like being the hot, hot traffic, and so people will want them to come.
So let me just, first of all, close before I thank our panelists. I just want to make 2 points, I guess. One is, this is in one way about a short-term battle, the next year or 2 or 3, and how do you do these, I don't say gimmicks, but budget tools to allow more national resources to go into this core area. That's obviously critical. It's obviously why we wrote this report. But I just want to raise the broader point that, fundamentally, this is really, really all about we have to raise taxes and we have to cut entitlements. I mean, there's no other way to make this all work. Because the end game is going to be essentially a research enterprise that's probably 50% of its current size in 15 years in real dollars. And I don't think anybody wants to live in that kind of world. Because I can tell you what kind of world that will be. That will be a world where the U.S. simply has ceded its technological leadership in a wide variety of areas. And I think, Bill, you may have made that point, and particularly in military. The Chinese are, you look at what the Chinese are doing. The Chinese now, by the way, are at current rates, within a decade, will be putting more money into R&D than we are. They're now exceed Europe. Well, think about that, poor country, China, they exceed Europe. in 10 years, they'll be exceeding us unless we keep going up. So this is really, I think, what this is all about. And you know, we can talk about these short-term things, which we should, but fundamentally, this is about a big national choice. So with that, I want to thank this really great panel we had today, and thank Joe for his great work on this report, and thank you for all attending.
Thanks, everybody.